This is Professor Lisa Taylor, and this is a video lecture on supplemental jurisdiction. And in this video, we're going to review some of the history of the development of the modern doctrine of supplemental jurisdiction, and then do sort of a brief breakdown of the supplemental jurisdiction statute. So, as sort of a foundation, let's make sure we understand the basic problem that gives rise to the need for supplemental jurisdiction. Suppose a plaintiff wants to sue a defendant for on a federal claim, but wants to join with it a state law claim, and the plaintiff and the defendant are from the same state. Those claims may be directly related, but without supplemental jurisdiction, the plaintiff has a problem and can't join that claim with the federal claim, the state law claim with the federal claim. So the question is then, can supplemental jurisdiction save the day? Begin with a basic premise, and that is, it's very important to bear this in mind throughout our discussion of supplemental jurisdiction, and that is that every claim needs its own statutory basis for subject matter jurisdiction in order for that claim to be asserted in a federal court lawsuit. So this takes us back to our study at the beginning of this course of the primary basis for federal subject matter jurisdiction. There's federal question jurisdiction under 28 U.S.C. section 1331, diversity of citizenship jurisdiction under 28 U.S.C. section 1332, and then now we're adding supplemental jurisdiction under 28 U.S.C. section 1367. Now, of course, there are some other federal bases for subject matter jurisdiction under other specific jurisdictional statutes, but these are the main categories and most of what we'll focus on for our purposes. So before we get into supplemental jurisdiction, let's just take a brief moment to review what we know about the core concepts underlying federal question jurisdiction and diversity jurisdiction. So as to federal question jurisdiction, recall that in analyzing whether it applies, we must look at only the well-pleaded complaint, the claims that the plaintiff must assert, and this wouldn't include anticipated offenses. So like in the Motley case where the references to the Constitution were in the complaint, that wasn't enough because they were merely a response to an anticipated defense by the defendant. The plaintiff's claims themselves were simply for breach of contract under state law. And then in looking at only what is on the face of the well-pleaded complaint, the court, or we in our case, must then apply either the creation test as what is the law that creates the cause of action, or in narrower circumstances, the substantial federal interest test, so that even some claims that are not created by federal law might still get into federal court if the state law claim implicates a substantial federal interest, as that test has been flushed out by a long line of Supreme Court cases. Then for diversity of citizenship, this should be sort of second nature to you by now. There's the complete diversity requirement, where diversity or citizenship is determined by domicile for individuals and principal place of business for corporations. Then there's the amount in controversy requirement, that the claim must exceed $75,000. So those are sort of the core requirements for diversity jurisdiction. Now, a little history. We're going to talk about the history of the development of the supplemental jurisdiction doctrine, and that's mostly going to be covered in this video lecture, and then we'll spend our time in class working through the problems that I have provided for you to work through utilizing the supplemental jurisdiction statute. So the doctrine of what we now know of as supplemental jurisdiction originated in case law, a series of Supreme Court decisions. Two of them are in your text, and I've asked you to read over those cases before looking at this video. So if you haven't looked at them yet, you should go do so, pause the video and come back. Those Supreme Court decisions were then codified into what we now know of as the Supplemental Jurisdiction Statute, codified at 28 U.S.C. section 1367, and that occurred in 1991. That being the case, that the statute is a codification of the prior Supreme Court decisions that originally developed the doctrine, the legislative history makes clear, and the courts have followed this instruction, that the statute is to be interpreted in accordance with the cases, with one exception, the Finley case that was overruled by the statute. But otherwise, the holdings of the Supreme Court cases are to be reflected in the statute. And so to the extent that there are ambiguities in interpretation, the court often tries to look to the prior case law to determine what it is that Congress might have intended or contemplated in drafting what we now know of as the Supplemental Jurisdiction Statute. Just an aside on terminology, and these terms are utilized in your text, so you've seen them having read through the text as assigned, but the terms that used to be used were pendant jurisdiction and ancillary jurisdiction, and they were sort of two sides of the same coin. Typically, pendant jurisdiction was that exercised over claims made by plaintiffs that weren't otherwise within the original jurisdiction of the federal court, and ancillary jurisdiction would cover claims made by defendants. But all those terms are old, and they typically don't apply anymore, and they've been supplanted by supplemental jurisdiction now. There are a few judges who've been around a long time that might still try to use that term every now and then. You may see a case that uses those terms, so you should be aware of them, but supplemental jurisdiction is the correct term to use now. So this next portion of this lecture, I'm going to walk you through the two principal cases that are in the text: United Mine Workers versus Gibbs, and the Owen Equipment versus Kroeber. And as I said, both of these cases are now, the holdings of these cases and the reasoning that underlies them are now reflected in the Supplemental Jurisdiction Statute. So even though the cases themselves have been superseded by the statute, it's important to understand how this body of law developed, because it informs how the law applies today. So in the Gibbs case, the plaintiff was a coal mine superintendent, and he lost his job in the wake of a labor dispute. And the details of that underlying labor dispute are not really important for our purposes. What's important for us to know is that Gibbs, who was a Tennessee citizen, sued the United Mine Workers, with the labor union whose strike caused him to lose his contract, and that the United Mine Workers as an association its citizenship was determined by reference to its members, and some of those members were also citizens of Tennessee, so there was no diversity between the parties. Nevertheless, he filed in federal court in the Eastern District of Tennessee, and he asserted a federal claim, violation of the Labor Management Relations Act. And in fact, he asserted several claims under the LMRA. But he also asserted state law claims for interference with contract. So this is the kind of scenario where supplemental jurisdiction becomes relevant. Here we have non-diverse parties who want to be in federal court, and there's federal question claims in the case, but there's also state law claims. So the question then becomes, does supplemental jurisdiction save the day as to those state law claims? Or must the plaintiff choose between severing the non-federal claims and pursuing them separately in state court, or taking the whole case to state court? Those would be the options if supplemental jurisdiction isn't available. So in the United Mine Workers case, as we said, the federal court had jurisdiction over that federal claim, but there was no diversity with respect to the state law claim. The plaintiff ultimately prevailed on only the state law claim, that no relief was granted under the federal law, although at least one of the federal claims went all the way to trial. So the question that came to the Supreme Court on appeal then was whether the district court properly entertained jurisdiction of the claim based on state law. And this was particularly notable because of the fact that the judgment entered ultimately pertained only to the state law claim. The court held that, yes, the district court could exercise jurisdiction over that state law claim. And what's important to understand is what the court decided about why that was so. And there's two components to the court's rationale. One is a policy-based rationale, and you can see this reflected in Justice Brennan's decision, where he talks about the concerns of judicial economy, convenience, and fairness to litigants, which support the outcome that the court reaches here. But it wasn't just as a policy matter. The court had to deal with the law as well. And in this case, the central limiting law was the Constitution. Because as you recall, the Constitution is the outer limit on the judicial power of the federal courts. So how is it that a federal court could, according to the Gibbs court, adjudicate a state law claim in the absence of any diversity between the parties? And quoted here on this slide what the court said about that. They said, pendent jurisdiction in the sense of judicial power exists whenever there is a claim arising under the Constitution, the laws of the United States, and the relationship between that claim and the state claim permits the conclusion that the entire action before the court comprises but one constitutional case. So essentially what the court is saying here is that the court has jurisdiction and power over the entire case under the Constitution when there's a federal claim in the lawsuit and another claim that's not a federal claim that has a sufficiently close relationship to it that it forms part of the same constitutional case. So what is the relationship that's required then? What does it mean to say that the claims form the same constitutional case? Well, the court provides some instruction about that. And I think the key language there is that the court says that those claims derive from a common nucleus of operative fact. And this is very similar, in fact, for most purposes is the same as the same transaction or occurrence standard that we've been talking about so much in the context of the joinder rules. And this is how, as I've said many times, we're going to see this again when we get to supplemental jurisdiction, that the relationship between the facts underlying the claims is key, not just to the joinder rules, but to the application of supplemental jurisdiction as well. And the court provided some additional instruction about how to apply that common nucleus of operative fact standard. The court says it should apply when plaintiff's claims are such that he would ordinarily be expected to try them all in one judicial proceeding. It just makes sense that he would pursue them all together. It's much more efficient, economical, and fair to do so, to implicate the policies that the court relied upon. And I've indicated here on this slide, you can see the notes after the case discussing this concept more specifically. Also notable about the Gibbs decision, so the central component of the Gibbs decision that we're going to be carrying forward and using and applying the supplemental jurisdiction statute is that concept of the constitutional case and how the court held that the exercise of, in that case, was called pendent jurisdiction, what we now call supplemental jurisdiction, was consistent with the Constitution, even where it involved asserting jurisdiction over a claim not otherwise within the original jurisdiction of the court, because the claim is sufficiently related that it forms part of the same constitutional case, i.e., it derives from a common nucleus of operative fact. So that's the key point that we need to take away from Gibbs. Beyond that, though, the court also talks about the fact that this is a discretionary tool for the court. So the court is not obligated in the way that it is if the parties are completely diverse and the amount of controversy is satisfied, or the claim arises out of federal law, then the exercise of jurisdiction by the federal court is not discretionary. So that makes supplemental jurisdiction unique by comparison to the other types of jurisdiction that can get a claim into federal court, in that the court does have discretion under the doctrine of supplemental jurisdiction, as we now call it, to decline jurisdiction, even if it otherwise theoretically applies. And here's what the court said about that. It said, the power need not be exercised in every case in which it is found to exist. Why is that? Well, needless decisions of state law should be avoided, both as a matter of comity and to promote justice between the parties. And that term comity, if you're not familiar with it, you should look it up in the dictionary, but it basically is about sort of full faith and credit and recognizing that each individual jurisdiction is its own entity, government body. So when is it that needless decisions of state law should be avoided in the exercise of the court's discretion? The court provided some instruction about that. Where the federal claims are dismissed before trial, where state issues substantially predominate, where novel or complex issues of state law are raised, or where there's some likelihood of jury confusion. So in any of these circumstances that might, but isn't, it's not a must, but it might provide a basis on which the court could decline to exercise jurisdiction. And here is a reference to where you can see this in the case and to where you can find discussion of it in the notes. So in applying that law to the facts then, the court concluded in Gibbs that the state law claims for breach of contract asserted by Gibbs derive from a common nucleus of operative fact. Both the state law claims and the Labor Management Relations Act claims, the federal claims, derive from the same operative facts, the nucleus of operative facts being the events that at the strike at the mining facility that eventually led to Gibbs losing the work there, but that they merely reflect alternative remedies, so that those claims could be brought together. And the court goes on to say that even though the federal claims ultimately failed, that doesn't mean that the court was wrong to adjudicate the related state law claims. So that, in a nutshell, is the Gibbs case. And we need to briefly break down then the Owen Equipment case before we move on to the statute. So in Owen Equipment, Mrs. Kroeber was the surviving spouse of a man, Mr. Kroeber presumably, who died in an accident when he was working on power lines and was electrocuted and killed. And this occurred in Nebraska. And so she was a citizen of Iowa, and she sued the Omaha Public Power District, whose lines were being operated. And then the OPPD then impleaded Owen Equipment, who owned the crane on which he was working. And you could just, as a brief review of Rule 14, joinder of a third-party defendant, and the court in footnote 3, go take a look at that, explains that that joinder was proper under the joinder rules because Owen Equipment was alleged to be a joint tortfeasor with OPPD, and that OPPD was seeking to recover on a contribution theory against OPPD. At the time that OPPD was joined, it was a Nebraska corporation, and that ultimately changed, as the slide indicates. At trial, then it became apparent that that was not correct, that actually Owen Equipment was an Iowa corporation, which raises a problem, as we know. But we'll come back to that in just a minute. So OPPD filed a motion for summary judgment and was seeking to get out of the lawsuit. And while that motion was pending, Kroeber asserted a claim directly against Owen Equipment. Perhaps she and her lawyer could see that OPPD was about to be dismissed, or at least might be. Well, as it turned out, OPPD was dismissed from the lawsuit, leaving only Kroeber's claims directly against Owen Equipment. Those went to trial, and it was at trial that it then became apparent that Owen Equipment was not, in fact, a Nebraska corporation, that it was an Iowa corporation. And of course, that creates a complete diversity problem. Now, our plaintiff and defendant are from the same state, and the only claims are claims of state law. At that point, go back to that. I can't quite see it all on my screen here. The Owen Equipment filed a motion to dismiss for lack of subject matter jurisdiction, and on the basis that there was no diversity jurisdiction. The court, when that question of whether there was subject matter jurisdiction in the case or not at that point, when it reached the Supreme Court held that the district court lacked jurisdiction over Kroeber's claim. That even though there was constitutionally sufficient minimum diversity at the time the case was filed, the lack of complete diversity destroyed jurisdiction over the case. And the court reasoned that Kroeber could not originally have brought suit against both defendants in federal court, so it shouldn't be allowed to assert those claims now. Note, though, that in so holding, the court noted a carve-out explaining that claims by defendants are different. And that's notable not because it applied here, because this was a claim by a plaintiff, Mrs. Kroeber, asserting a claim against the defendant. But we see that reflected in the supplemental jurisdiction statute. So that's another aspect of the case that is codified into the statute itself. So now we get to the modern world and the supplemental jurisdiction statute itself. And I want you to take out your supplement and make sure you have the statute in front of you as we work through breaking down the statute. And I'm just going to kind of explain to you how all the parts of it work here. So if you need to, you can pause the video, go get your statutory supplement, or get a copy of the statute in some form to have it in front of you while you listen to this part of the video. So under paragraph A of the supplemental jurisdiction statute is sort of the broad conferral of supplemental jurisdiction, and that applies the Gibbs concept that where there's already a claim in the federal court that has a proper basis for original jurisdiction, then supplemental jurisdiction exists over all other claims that form part of the same constitutional case. So we'll look at that in just a minute. Paragraph B is an exception to the conferral of supplemental jurisdiction as reflected in the holding of the Kroeber case, so that sometimes even if the conferral of supplemental jurisdiction under paragraph A might reach a particular claim, as would have been the case for Kroeber's claim against Owen Equipment, there are nevertheless circumstances where the court still shouldn't or can't exercise jurisdiction over that claim. And then there's paragraph C, which reflects the discretionary factors that we identified as having been pronounced in the Gibbs case. So let's talk through each of these sections one by one. As far as the broad conferral of supplemental jurisdiction in paragraph A goes, focus on this language that supplemental jurisdiction is conferred first of all, in any civil action of which the district courts have original jurisdiction. So that's sort of a threshold requirement. The court must have basis for original jurisdiction over at least one claim. So there's always got to be something for the supplemental jurisdiction to attach to. So you've always got to look for at least one claim within the court's original jurisdiction. And if there is one, then the district courts shall have supplemental jurisdiction over all other claims that are so related to the claims in the action within such original jurisdiction that they form part of the same case or controversy under Article 3. This is basically the Gibbs standard, and the courts have uniformly interpreted this to mean that if the claims form part of the same constitutional case or derive from a common nucleus of operative fact, then supplemental jurisdiction under Part A would apply. And notably, the last sentence of that paragraph says that supplemental jurisdiction includes claims that involve the joinder or intervention of parties. So we'll have lots of chances to practice applying that. Paragraph B then is the big exception, and this is the Kroeber exception basically. And that section says that the district court shall not have supplemental jurisdiction, and there's 4 components to this exception. And I'm breaking the statute down for you. I want you to walk through the statute with me while I do this and see where each of these requirements is embodied in the statute. But by doing this here, then we'll already have that foundation when we go to work through the problems that I've circulated in class. So first, the exception applies only in cases where original jurisdiction is founded solely on Section 1332 of this title. So remember, under paragraph A, there's got to be at least one claim within the court's original jurisdiction. And under paragraph B then, when the only basis for original jurisdiction is diversity under Section 1332, then you've got to consider whether the other components of the exception apply or not. So what are those other components? First of all, the exception applies only to claims by plaintiffs and against persons who are made parties under Rule 14, 19, 20, or 24. And those rules might have looked like a bunch of garble just a week or two ago, but now that we've walked through all those rules in the last week or two, they what they are and what they mean should be a little bit clearer to you. And fourthly, then, that when you've got a case that is only within the federal court on the basis of diversity jurisdiction and involves a claim by a plaintiff against a person made party under one of those applicable rules, then the court doesn't have jurisdiction when exercising supplemental jurisdiction would be inconsistent with the jurisdictional requirements of Section 1332. So think for just a minute about the Kroeber case. That's essentially what was going on there. The only claims in the case were diversity, that were properly in federal court on the basis of diversity jurisdiction. Kroeber, the plaintiff, was asserting a claim against a person made party under Rule 14, and that was Owen Equipment, and that exercising jurisdiction over that claim would be inconsistent with the jurisdictional requirements of 1332. So that exception applies in that context, and jurisdiction would not be proper there. Then just a quick breakdown of paragraph C, the discretionary factors. We see these reflected very similarly to the way the court laid them out in the Gibbs case. So the court can choose to decline jurisdiction if the claim raises a novel or complex issue of state law, the state law claim substantially predominates, the district court has dismissed all claims over which it has original jurisdiction, or there's, in extraordinary circumstances, other compelling reasons for declining jurisdiction. So before I leave you here, here's what I want you to do to check your understanding of the concepts that I have described here and that you've read about in chapter 20 of your text. First, and I've already kind of walked you through some of this with respect to the Kroeber case just a moment ago, but I want you to try to practice applying the statute in a step-by-step way, beginning with paragraph A and then walking through paragraphs B and C to the extent they're applicable. And to both of the principal cases, to the facts of the principal cases, Gibbs and Kroeber, and see if you can see how it is that the statute reflects those same concepts that the court pronounced in those cases. Then take some time to work through the problems that are labeled A through G on pages 749 to 51 of the text, making sure you understand how the statute applies in each of those problems and what result it yields. And I think these are really good examples of there's basically a variation that implicates each of the parts of the statute. So study those and then prepare the problems that I posted. And by prepare, I don't mean that you need to have anything in writing ready to turn in. I just want you to have worked through them on your own so that when we go to talk about them in class, you'll have thought about them before and be ready to offer your understanding of how those problems should be resolved. So that's what I'm looking for, and I will see you in class to discuss this in more detail.